How to knit around on 2 circular needles. This is an ingenious technique first developed by Joyce Williams. Unfortunately now the late Joyce Williams, but a brilliant knitter who lived in Wisconsin and was a disciple of Elizabeth Zimmerman and Meg Swanson, and she came up with this brilliant idea of not having to use double points so you could knit around on 2 circular needles. Generally, Joyce recommended that you use needles longer than 16 inches. Even if you have a small area of knitting, as I do here, 16-inch needle would work, but the tips would be so close to the knitting, like this, on both ends, that they would get in your way. So Joyce suggested using 24-inch needles. And while you're learning, it's helpful maybe to have 2 different companies' needles so you can tell the needles apart. So I'm going to show you how to knit around on 2 circular needles. It's especially handy if you're knitting sleeves of a sweater. I never knit sleeves of a sweater separately. I knit them both at the same time. It's really great because your increases and decreases are done at exactly the same time. You're in the same mood when you pick up your knitting for both sleeves. So it's just a really good way to knit. Now, what you basically do is you arrange your knitting half of the stitches on one circular and half on another, although it doesn't really matter. You don't have to be exactly in half. It still works. Now my yarn is here. It just completed a stitch and my next stitch is here. So I'm going to prep this needle, get it all ready to knit. Here is how you do it. You make sure that as you knit each half of your piece of knitting, you use the same needle. So you can see I've got my transparent coil going here, and I'm using the same needle to knit. I'm not using the other needle at all. And I'm just simply going to knit right across half of the stitches on this glove. And when I get to the end of this, I will say to myself, same needle, new yarn. It was Meg Swanson who told me that little mantra. At the halfway point, I say, same needle, as you'll see. New yarn. So I'm continuing with this needle. I'm going to slide over my other half, and I make sure that I'm using a new strand of yarn. As it happens, I have wound 2 strands here, and I've got them in one ball. But you know, you could be using 2 different balls of needles. And Joyce Williams, even when she was doing the fingers of a glove, she would have all 10 fingers with separate little balls of yarn each on the same long, on the same 2 circular needles. Okay, so I'm here. I'm using the same needle, the same transparent coil, and I am now working with a different yarn, and I'm going across here and doing the same thing. So I knit across this needle. And again, using Meg Swanson's mantra, when I get to the end of this needle, I'm going to say, same yarn, new needle. Okay, the second half, the first half of the second glove is nearly done. And in theory, I don't have to let go of the yarn. And I'll try to hold on to it just so you can see how I'm using the same yarn to continue. Alright, the knitting is done on half of each of the gloves. I'm done with this needle. I'm going to pull it up and let it hang. And now I'm going to turn everything around and knit from the other side. And I will try to hold on to the yarn so you can see that it is indeed the same yarn, new needle. Okay, now I've got the needle with the black coil. And again, I pull up my needle. Now notice, this needle is not quite going through as smoothly as my first needle, so let me tell you right now, this happens to be an old inox needle. These are the needles of choice. Haya Haya are the most wonderful needles. The joins of the Haya Haya are so smooth that they just flow right in and out, and I truly recommend, I highly recommend the Haya Haya needles for any of your fixed needle knitting. Okay, so now I take the same needle, I'm taking my new needle with the black coil, and I did drop the yarn to show you those needles, and I knit across here. So as long as you can remember that you never use two ends of opposite needles, you will be fine. As long as you use the same needle all the time, two ends of the same needle. Now I have a little joke that might help you remember that. And I will tell you the joke, but it's not funny unless you remember your high school biology. Okay, so again, I am using the same needle, two ends of the same needle. As you can see, this other needle is just hanging out of the way. That's why Joyce liked using a long needle, not a 16-inch needle. And I am using two ends of the same needle. And again, see, at high, was much better at pushing through. So I really recommend the high. Okay. All right, now we start knitting we're on our second one. It's the same needle, new yarn. Okay, here's my little joke. One worm said to another worm, I love you, I love you, I love you. So it's like this worm saying it to this worm, I love you, I love you, I love you. And the other worm said, shut up, I'm your other end. Now, if you can remember this, then you will remember always use the same ends of the same needle, the two ends of the same needle. And you don't have to fall in love with each end, but that will help you remember. Now, after Joyce Williams published this idea of using two circulars to knit around, someone else, and I don't know who it is, and I don't know if anyone really is taking credit, but someone else came up with the idea of doing the same thing with one long circular. As it happens, long circulars are pretty readily available now. So I'm going to transfer this knitting to one long circular and show you that it's really the same principle that Joyce Williams used, and I'll show you how to set that up. I have the same size needle here and one beautiful Haya 40-inch needle, and I'm going to use this in the same technique, and I'll show you how you do it. In this case, we don't need worms to remind us of what to do. We need dog ears, and I'll explain that as we go. Okay, this is my next bit of knitting, and I'm going to transfer it now to this long needle, and I'll knit right across here. By the way, if you're wondering what these gloves are, these are Iranian style of gloves, started at the top with the Middle East cast on. These are knit from the tips down, just to show you the fingers are all knit, they're a little bit of decreasing, the hand is knit, the thumb is knit, and then your gusset is formed as the thumb decreases. It's a brilliant, very organic design that came from gloves that I bought in Iran. Priscilla Gibson Roberts translated it, figured out how they were made, published it in Knitters Magazine number 33, and these are the only gloves I care to knit. They're so much fun to knit, and they get to try them on as you knit them. Okay, and again I'm continuing as it were with the same needle, new yarn, halfway point. Let's go right across and knit this. When I get to the end of this, I'm going to let go of my first needle because I've just put in my long needle, and now I'm going to continue with the same yarn and same needle, but with a dog ear in between, as you'll see. The Haya needles I purchased from Schoolhouse Press. If your local yarn shop doesn't have them, you can certainly get them from Schoolhouse Press. Okay, I am at the end of my second glove, first half. I'm going to just let this needle go. I'm going to pull this needle, so you see it's sticking out at this end, and I'm going to turn it around to this side, and I'm going to leave a little ear as I continue my knitting. And that is basically how this works, but I'll go ahead and do the whole thing and show you exactly. So now, even though I'm continuing with the same needle, I am not continuing with the same needle held close. I'm making sure there's a dog ear between the one side of the glove and the next side. So I'm continuing with the same yarn, and as it happens with the same needle, but it will be separated by a dog ear. That dog ear kind of big now, but it's going to get small. Now once you master this with one long circular, or even two circulars, you can finish a hat with circular needles instead of double points if you want. As long as you remember, you've got to keep a gap on each side. Okay, we get across here. And then when I get to the end of this needle, I'm going to get new yarn for my second half of the second glove. Okay, new yarn, and I'll pull this up. Whew, that is really an awkward join. And it would be a lot easier if it weren't, but there it is. Okay, so now I'm going to continue with the same needle, which I would anyway. New yarn, and go right across. Again, I'm pulling that up firmly, of course. Now notice my dog ear over on this, on my right, getting a little smaller, and when I pull it through, it'll be smaller yet. Okay, as I get to the end, remember now I'm going to continue with the same yarn on the other half. This needle is history. So now I've got everything on one long circular. I am not going to pull that so close that I can't find it again. I'm going to pull enough out, turn things around, and I'm going to put this needle in position to knit. You notice that needle goes through much more easily. And see, I've still got my dog ear, and I start making a dog ear. You have a dog ear on each side, and I would just knit across here and continue. So now what I would do is I would put this needle in position, I would knit across again, and continue. Just making sure that no matter what I do, I keep a dog ear on each side. If you're afraid of losing that spot, you can put a nice big coilless pin right where you need it, just to remind yourself that when you pull it up later, this is where your spot is. But just try not to pull this so tightly that you can't find it. And you could put another pin on this side if you needed to. So this could mark your way if you had to keep it track. But just pull your needle around, get yourself in a needle position, and continue to knit around on both gloves at the same time with one long circular. The same principle that Joyce Williams had on two circulars, but you can do it with one, as it's called, a magic loop. Good technique to know, especially when you're doing sleeves of a sweater. Okay.